Hello again and welcome to Forum for a Better Understanding. This is our 373rd episode, and it's a pleasure to have a very special guest to share with us a very important issue and a brand new book that she and some other colleagues have published this very week. My guest today is Trudy Conway, a professor of philosophy at Mount St. Mary's University in Emmitsburg, Pennsylvania. She's written extensively in the areas of contemporary philosophy, virtue ethics, and intercultural dialogue. She contributes to the educational initiatives of the Catholic Mobilizing Network to end the use of the death penalty. And she's here today as part of a visit to California State University, Fresno, where she spoke on Where Justice and Mercy Meet, Catholic Opposition to the Death Penalty, a book that was just published by Liturgical Press, which she and some fellow professors at St. Mary's University created together. I'm really excited that you're here, Trudy. I heard you speak at the Newman Center the other evening, but tell us a little bit about your connection with Dr. Fiala and how it is that you were invited out to Fresno State.
Thank you, Jim, and it's a pleasure to be here. I know Andy Fiala, who's a philosophy professor at Fresno State, for about 15 years. We are both active, and in fact, he's very active. He's the journal editor for the Society for Philosophy in the Contemporary World. And it's a special kind of society where we gather once a week to hear papers and to really form communion and friendship with people who share similar interests. And the people in the society are interested in having philosophy engage issues in the contemporary world. So it attracts a particular group of people. And you know Andy. He's very interested in peace studies and tolerance and civil discourse. And he and I actually have we have many common interests. So from this type of society, you develop friendships. And Andy has become a friend, and I'm very interested in the kind of work he does at the Ethics Center, and so it's been a pleasure to visit.
It's a pleasure knowing Andy. He has brought us other guests. He's been on the program. Now, one person who was meaning to be on the program with you at Fresno State, and also on our table today, is Vicki Schieber. Now, can you tell us about Vicki? We have some pictures that will give us a little bit of idea of the greatness of Vicki. Why don't you introduce us to your good friend?
Sure, and I really regret she's not here because she's definitely the better second half of this team. And she's an amazing person. She's a national abolitionist. She's very well known in the abolitionist community. She was honored by the U.S. bishops for her abolition work and also by the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty. She was named Abolitionist of the Year a year ago.
Wow.
Vicki is an amazing person. She's nonstop in terms of her work and her service. And right now she can't be with us because Maryland is poised. Today, the Judiciary Committee is voting to move the bill out of committee, and then it will go before the legislature. And Governor O'Malley and the U.S. bishops definitely wanted Vicki there because she's a powerful spokesman. So she works with legislatures, she works with a wide range of murder victim family member organizations, and she and I, do you want me to tell you how we got to know each other?
That would be great, and then you'll introduce us to the very issue for which she'll be speaking about her daughter, and about the effort of people being able to respond not in vengeance, but actually with a mission for mercy.
Yes. Interestingly, Vicki and I have both been, it's a little over 10 years, about 12 years, we've been working on this issue. And we both became involved through our daughters when they were university students. My daughter was at a university in Washington, and she was very active in opposing the death penalty. And she came home one day and said to me, you've always been against the death penalty, but you don't do a thing about it. And that began, that query, that chastisement really began my journey. Vicki's was a very different journey. She had a beautiful, amazingly talented, wonderful young daughter, Shannon, who had gone to Duke University and then had gotten a full fellowship to the University of Pennsylvania. And she had just finished her first year of studies when she was raped and murdered. And this began Syl and Vicki Schieber's journey. How would they respond to the brutality and loss of Shannon? And before that, like many people, she knew very little about the death penalty. And the more she became educated, the more she felt that she had to be a witness to the kind of values and principles that informed Shannon's whole way of life and her spirit. And so rather than being consumed with rage and anger, Vicki and Syl opposed a death penalty for their daughter's killer, and then she began a really lifetime commitment on a state level in Maryland and also nationally to end the death penalty. And so how did we get to know? My daughter invited her to come to her university in D.C. She spoke very highly of her, and I applied for a grant through our university. And it funded a whole range of speakers coming to campus. And we brought exonerated death row inmates, scholars, murder victim family members, and one of them was Vicki. And she is such a powerful speaker. I started to bring her back every time I taught a course on the death penalty. Then it ended up, she was working with the Catholic Mobilizing Network, which was formed by Sister Helen Prejean, and I can explain a little bit about that. And then now Vicki has an office at Mount St. Mary's, and she and I work with interns who are doing intensive work to end the death penalty, and she co-teaches a course with me. So she has a strong presence, and it's not just what she does in the course, she's a witness on our campus, and she has very, very deep effect on many of our students.
Now, the effect that Vicki has is that even as we are doing this program, as we're recording the program, you have a news bulletin from Maryland.
Yes.
The success of Vicki's presence at the Statehouse, with the governor,
yes, with
the community in Maryland. What happened?
Well, this morning I received an email which was commenting on a Washington Post article, and it mentioned that one of the committee members, Senator Serkin, who my understanding is he was opposed to the repeal effort, but after he met with murder victim family members like Vicki, he came to realize that it did not promise to deliver what they had hoped for. And when he learned that many murder victim family members actually oppose executions, he changed his vote. So it is expected that it will come out of committee today, and we do have the votes to pass this, and it'll make Maryland the 18th state. We had hoped California would be the 18th state, but hopefully that will happen in the future.
What is so exciting is that Vicki, who was in touch with me over her disappointment of not being able to be here, had the best reason for not being here is to speak for mercy and justice in Maryland, to have a monumental decision made by that state to become, as Trudy said, the 18th of our 50 states, to finally see the light and do the right thing. Now, another person who has seen the light and has been doing the right thing for a long time now is our good friend, Sister Helen Prejean. Sister Helen came to the diocese in May last year and gave a fantastic talk at St. Philip's. We want to have Trudy tell us about the connection that Sister Helen has with the book that we're going to be talking about in a minute. But let's have Trudy introduce us to the work of Sister Helen Prejean, personal and professional, with you.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mentioned how Vicki and Syl Schieber did not know much about the death penalty, and anyone who's read Sister Helen Prejean's book, Dead Man Walking, it tells her journey and her immersion in this experience and how transformative it was. When the bishops became extremely vocal and set forth this challenge to Catholics to be actively involved with repeal of the death penalty, Sister Helen recognized that you had numerous Catholic organizations, but they weren't centralized. So she decided to form the Catholic Mobilizing Network to end the use of the death penalty. And this is based in Washington. And then, as I said, we have an office at Mount St. Mary's. We do the educational resource development from our office. The book is part of that initiative. And the aim was to have a website and an organization that would develop research materials, educational materials, parish workshop programming materials, so that people would have easy access if they wanted to do these types of programming. And it also has information about speakers, and it's a wonderful website. So they were doing this, and then they contacted me through my knowing Vicki and asked if I would be willing to do some work on their educational resource materials. And then the next request was whether I would do a book. And so Sister Helen wants to educate Catholics. She often says that support for the death penalty in the United States is a mile wide, but it's an inch deep. And that the more people, especially Catholics, learn about the death penalty, the more their support for it declines. And what she was concerned, and I have found that I've been at Mount St. Mary's University in Maryland for 34 years, and we have a seminary. It's one of the oldest seminaries in the country. And I always have the sense that the Catholic Church's position on the death penalty is the best kept secret. Yeah. So she wanted the Catholic Mobilizing Network to educate people and also to facilitate an active engagement with this issue. So then she asked, the Catholic Mobilizing asked if I would write this book. So that's where we got to this point.
Now, before we get into the book, there's one more thing I'd like you to tell us about the impact of Sister Helen based on the film Dead Men Walking. Mm-hmm. It seems that the book is making it very clear that instead of philosophical arguments, it really takes human stories and things that are visual and things that are personal. And that movie, which so many of us have seen and enjoyed in a very profound way of enjoying a very difficult message, what would be for you the impact that you have seen because of Sister Helen's book and the film?
Well, executions years ago used to happen in the public square, and thousands, tens of thousands of people attended them. So people were very aware of executions. But what has happened is they have moved into the hidden recesses of prisons, and they're very tightly controlled, they follow strict protocols, and there's very few witnesses. So oftentimes people don't know there are even executions occurring. Sometimes there's a notice in a paper about it, but it doesn't have any impact on our lives. I think what Sister Helen did through the film, even the book definitely, but even more so with the film, was she brought the reality of the death penalty, the human reality of the death penalty, in a way that got under people's skin. They were troubled by this. They began to reflect on it. And I'm a philosopher, and I recognize the great importance of arguments. And scholars tend to emphasize arguments, but the Supreme Court has issued, reams of arguments on the death penalty, divided arguments. It doesn't move people. They're abstract, they're very technical, but stories move people. And so we decided to, actually in the initial planning, we didn't have a chapter on the power of stories, but when I was close to working with David McCarthy, a theologian who worked with us on the book, we recognized that one of the most important chapters was the chapter on the power of stories. And we were convinced that Sister Helen's book and the film is what moved the American public to be caring about this issue, to begin a reflection on this issue. So the power of stories to change minds and hearts is what we very much wanted to focus on. And Sister Helen emphasized, when she met with the faculty who were working on the book, she said two major points. Make sure you frame the death penalty as a moral argument, and secondly, make sure you bring people into the reality of the death penalty. So what we did was, with each chapter leading into a particular discussion, we begin with a story.
Right now, though, what we're going to do is take our break, and when we come back, we'll look at the structure of the book and look at the 16 chapters, which really are something you are going to want to read, and you're going to want to study this book in community. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
KNXT thanks all its loyal viewers and respected businesses who have supported your Catholic television station. Now you can support KNXT with program underwriting by having your name, your company's name, or organization associated with your favorite program. Detailed information about you or your company will appear before and after each program or day part you select. Keep the quality and spiritual message alive and make a difference. Call 559-488-7440 today or go online at knxt.tv to find out more about program underwriting on KNXT.
Hello again and welcome back to the second part of our conversation with Trudy Conway, who comes to us from Mount St. Mary's University in Emmitsburg, Pennsylvania, to share commitment to the abolition of the death penalty. We're going to talk in this half of the program about the book, which was just published very recently from Liturgical Press. You could find that book on the website at Liturgical Press, litpress.org. And when you go there, you'll be able to find out much more about this book and why it was written and how to purchase. Right now, Trudy, could you walk us through the structure? I think you've got a really tremendous way of engaging so many faculty. Tell us how the book came to be.
Okay. And can I just mention, Mount St. Mary's is in Maryland. And the reason why you... See, I live in Pennsylvania, right at the border. The school is about 10 miles down from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. So I actually live in Pennsylvania, but the school is in Maryland.
We should always know the state in which we're talking about, especially since the Statehouse that we saw earlier, the governor that we saw, O'Malley, it's all about Maryland.
Right, right. But then we will move on to Pennsylvania in a few years. So
definitely.
Okay. Initially, I was asked to do the book, and then I contacted David McCarthy, who's a very prominent Catholic theologian, and asked if he would be willing to work with me on it. And what we thought was it would have greater impact, it would be a better book, if we could draw a number of scholars. So we invited, I think it's 13 or 14 scholars. Only one of them was outside Mount St. Mary's at the time. Christian Rethinking, who has a wonderful book on capital punishment in the Catholic moral tradition. He had spoken on campus a number of times, so we invited him. But we invited faculty from a range of disciplines, and we met for a series of discussions. We brought in prominent speakers. So we were in conversation about the death penalty for about a year and a half, and then everyone went off and wrote their individual chapters. And then David McCarthy and I wrote the lead-ins that I mentioned, these stories that engage the issues. And Sister Helen emphasized a number of points, and she gave us very good advice. She said, start the book with where we are today, all right, so that people can become educated and can be engaged in the contemporary issue. So the first part of the book is, it's called The Death Penalty Today. And we have a wonderful opening chapter by a sociologist, Kim Hansen, which brings us right into the issues that the courts are facing today and individual states are facing today, and that is the issue of lethal injection. A lot of people are not aware of that executions have been suspended for practical problems. The European Union is very much opposed to our execution system. And many of the American pharmaceutical companies refuse to allow their drugs to be used because pharmaceutical companies are committed to the promotion of life and health. So they didn't want their drugs being used for execution. So then states had to turn to Europe. And then the European Union governments found out about this, and they actually passed laws banning the exporting of drugs that would eventually be used in executions. So we couldn't execute people because we didn't have the drugs. And now states are scrambling to try to figure out how can we move forward in light of this practical problem. So Kim explores that. Then the next chapter, a political scientist, Amanda Beal, she looks at our practice from the lens of the international community. And many people are really shocked when they find out that we are part of a very problematic group of nations. The cohort that we are with concerning executions are a group of nations whose human rights policies we consistently condemn. So we're caught in an inconsistency. The countries that have the highest number of executions, it is China, North Korea, Yemen, Iran, then the United States, and then Saudi Arabia. So we are with a group of people who we consistently critique. All right, so this is very troubling. So she looks at this issue. How do we stand in relation to the rest of the world? And also, not only in the United States do you have this movement towards repeal of the death penalty, but you have it internationally. There's an amazing dynamic towards repeal across countries. So we're the outlier. We're not in sync with our own value systems, our own international principles that we affirm in terms of human rights, and we are also contrary to the trend of nations which are moving towards repeal. The third chapter is my chapter, and I give an overview of the most significant Supreme Court rulings. Now, that takes a whole chapter, but I'll mention a few things. Some Americans are not aware of the fact that we actually ended the death penalty. In 1972, the Furman v. Georgia ruling deemed that the practice of the death penalty was unconstitutional because it was unfairly and arbitrarily applied. So executions stopped. And the Supreme Court said that individual states could reapply for beginning again executions so long as they could introduce protocols which showed that the death penalty was fairly applied and non-arbitrarily applied. So a number of states did this. This is where you started getting your bifurcated system, where you first determine guilt or innocence, and then you move towards considering whether the person is eligible for a death sentence. It also resulted in you having an automatic retrial, and a number of factors were introduced to try to make the system fairer. So in 1976, the Gregg v. Georgia ruling reinstated the death penalty. One of the things that's really interesting about the Supreme Court rulings is its endless tinkering. If you go back to the founding of our country, a decision that had to be made by the founding fathers was whether we will have the death penalty. And throughout our whole history, we have been conflicted and morally troubled by this practice. Some people wanted to end the death penalty to distance ourselves from Britain. Other people thought it was cruel and unusual. Others thought it was important to maintain this type of practice. One of the co-signers of the Declaration of Independence, Benjamin Rush, and he actually founded a university right near mine. It's Dickinson College. He was an outspoken opponent of the death penalty, but it was interesting his reasoning. He was not opposed to the death penalty solely because of what it did to the person who was executed. He was opposed to the death penalty because of what it did to us as a society. He thought it had, over time, a brutalizing and coarsening effect. If you respond to violence and the loss of life with more violence and the loss of life, he thought this would coarsen our society. Then the next chapter is the power of stories, which we talked about, how stories change people's minds and hearts. Then the second part is focusing on a Christian rethinking of the death penalty. The first chapter talks about how the Eucharistic celebration of the Mass and different parts of the Mass bring us to reflect on issues relevant to the death penalty. So it's mainly focusing on Eucharistic forgiveness and healing. The next chapter talks about actually the execution of Christ and how the sacrifice that Christ made ended this desire that we have to scapegoat people, to find a way of expressing our vengeance and our desire for retaliation, and that Christ actually brought about a transformation of this kind of response. Then there's a wonderful chapter. It's the chairman of my department, the philosophy department, who's an Orthodox Jew. And we find that many people use this reasoning of an eye for an eye, and they have no understanding of the actual meaning of it in Scripture. So he does a wonderful study of it. And then the final chapter in that section is written by Sister Mary Kate Bird, who is also a Josephite like Sister Helen Prejean, and she does a close analysis of the Gospels. And she entitles it, "What Would Jesus Do?" And looking at what Jesus said and what Jesus did, she concludes it's absolutely clear that Jesus would not support executions. Then the heavy lifting is in part 3. And this is where Christian Brugger, he takes us through a very, very well-written study of the ancient, medieval, and early modern views of the church concerning the death penalty. So he goes from the beginning of Christianity all the way to the modern age. And then the church today, he talks about the further development in the modern period where the church starts to move towards a strong position against the death penalty. Then Monsignor Swetland, who is a moral philosopher and theologian at Mount St. Mary's, he's also a vice president, he does a close analysis of the catechism and transformations in the wording of the catechism under its revision and how that brought about a rethinking of the death penalty. And then he focuses primarily on the encyclical of Pope John Paul II, the Gospel of Life, which really built the momentum towards the U.S. bishops taking a very strong position on this. Then the final chapter, what Sister Helen recommended is begin with current realities, go to the Christian understanding, go through the tradition of the church, and then come back to the impact of the current situation on people, all right, returning to powerful stories of people. And what we focused on is the fact that the people who are at risk of being sentenced to death within the criminal justice system are the marginalized, the powerless, and the voiceless. So we call this section the least of these, which Christians are called to be attentive to and supportive of. So the first chapter in this section talks about the economics of the death penalty, and it lays out the fact that money matters. First of all, you've addressed this issue in California, the prohibitively expensive costs. And Sister Helen always argues the economics issue is a moral argument because you only have so many resources. And if you're going to put millions, and in some cases with California, actually $250 million into the death penalty, you're diverting resources from things like drug rehabilitation, crime prevention, support of murder victim family members, and education, healthcare. So it's definitely a diversion, and most people are not aware of how prohibitively expensive it is.
What we have to do right now is let you know that we'll be back next week with Trudy Conway to finish the description of this book and also personal stories about the importance of connecting with this issue, not only philosophically and theologically, historically, but very personally. And I hope you're enjoying this challenging conversation, that you'll join us next week when we pick up with part 2. Till then, God bless.